Well, thank you. Thank you again for joining us. And tonight I'm going to be speaking on microgreens. And I'm speaking tonight as a hobbyist. So this is something that I just started to do because it was a lot of fun for me. And I'm hoping this is something that you can do during the winter. And during the winter, we're all craving fresh produce. We're craving a touch of green. And this is really just something to tide us over until spring comes and we can get into our gardens. But it's absolutely a fun way to make the winter pass. All right, so I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to move this so I can see. There we go. Well, first of all, I'm going to talk about why I transitioned from growing sprouts to microgreens. I have to tell you, I grew up in a family that ate a lot of alfalfa sprouts. We were a family that really enjoyed growing this crop during the winter time. You know, we would grow it in a mason jar. And my mother really loved to add it to salads and things during the winter. So I just grew up having sprouts, and it's always been something that that was part of my diet. And sprouts were fabulous because they provided a lot of nutrition. They were very quick to grow. We could grow it in like 3 days or so, and you needed very little equipment. You could get by with a mason jar and cheesecloth, or else you could buy a sprout tray. So it was really easy to grow. But I have to admit, we have definitely transitioned away from sprouts. And that is because I started becoming aware of all of the foodborne outbreaks that are related to sprouts. So this is just showing all of the multi-state outbreaks since 2009. And the CDC keeps track of these outbreaks if they involve more than one state. So here you can see we've got a number of them. And going all the way back to 2009, and you look at the types of sprouts. It's all different types of sprouts. It's alfalfa, it's clover, bean sprouts, soybean sprouts, and spicy sprouts. And then you get to see the type of bacteria that is causing these foodborne illnesses. We've got Salmonella, E. coli, and Listeria. So this really alarmed me because, you know, I want to make sure that I'm feeding my family foods that are safe to eat. And I have to admit that in the past, I have suffered from food poisoning, not from sprouts, but I know how devastating it can be. I ended up actually in the emergency room as a result of that. But just going into a little bit more in depth here as to the statistics for these foodborne outbreaks, you can see in the second column, we have the number of individuals that ended up becoming sick. We have in the third column how extensive the spread was, you know, how many states were involved in these foodborne outbreaks. Fortunately, we haven't had too many deaths. We've had like 2 deaths, which it could have been worse. And then we've had numerous hospitalizations. So you can see there's reason to be concerned with respect to sprouts. And what's the problem with sprouts? Well, with sprouts, we're trying to germinate a seed, and that seed can become contaminated. This contamination can start in the field. So, you know, obviously they're growing crops like alfalfa to produce the seed for sprouts, but lots of things can go wrong in the field. We can have wildlife that wanders through the seed field, spreading feces. We can have birds. We can have manure as an issue, and I know a lot of our organic producers use manure. If the manure is not composted, it can, in fact, introduce Salmonella and E. coli into that system. So then we take our sprouts, or we then take the seed and try and germinate them for sprouts, but then the bacteria can actually live on the seed surface. Now, individuals can try and disinfect their seeds, but this is not 100% reliable. Now, you can certainly do like a bleach, a 1 to 10 bleach soak for a few minutes. But the problem is that we cannot, we can't reliably disinfect the seed coats if the seed coat has a lot of ridges on it. So if you look at the next slide, you'll see that we've got 2 different kinds of seeds. In in the box labeled A, that's a Swiss chard seed. And you can see it's got all sorts of nooks and crannies. It's very rough. You can imagine that the bacteria can in fact lurk in those nooks and crannies. Now, we do have other seeds that are smoother and it's easier to disinfect them. But you can see how there can be some variation as we go from seed to seed. We then take our seeds that we're trying to sprout, we put them in a mason jar, and we try and germinate them. And the process of germinating sprouts is we keep them moist, we do, rinses throughout the day. But this is really an environment that is conducive to growing bacteria. So you can see how growing sprouts can be quite problematic. The FDA has become so concerned about alfalfa sprouts as a potentially as a problem that they have categorized it as a potentially hazardous food. They recommend that individuals that have various illnesses, that have compromised immune systems, should not ingest raw sprouts. This would include the following groups: children, the elderly, pregnant people, and people with immune compromised conditions. For example, I've got a nephew who has, been through a heart transplant. He would be an individual that should never consume raw sprouts. Now, we do know that you can cook sprouts, particularly bean sprouts, to kill the harmful bacteria, but I don't think any of you out there wants to cook alfalfa sprouts. You'd end up with a pile of mush. So this is why I have switched from growing from sprouts to microgreens. I believe that growing microgreens carries less risk to it. And microgreens are relatively new. So back in the 1990s, we had some San Francisco Bay Area chefs that started growing microgreens and and started, using them as vegetable confetti. And when I call them vegetable confetti, they use it as a garnish, but it could certainly be added to sandwiches and soups and such. And then Charlie Trotter became aware of the microgreens, and he was one of the celebrity chefs from Chicago. And this is before we had all of these, fancy chef shows that are on the Food Network and such. But Charlie Trotter was quite popular in Chicago. He was into gourmet foods, and he wanted to serve something that was more novel. So what he did was he contracted with a local grower to grow microgreens because that would be something different. Everybody during the 1990s was using baby greens, but microgreens was something new and fresh. So he popularized microgreens, and now we see them served at fancy restaurants across the United States. And we know they're very nutritious to consume, and we're going to talk more about the nutrition of various microgreens. They're easy to grow, maybe not as easy as growing sprouts, but they take a very limited amount of time, somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 to 21 days to grow. And most importantly, there have been no CDC foodborne outbreaks with respect to microgreens. So that's very important for everybody to know. Now, we can't say that there is zero risk in growing microgreens. I mean, there's risk in doing anything. And in fact, there have been a small number of recalls, but they have not made consumers sick. Now, first, we need to distinguish between sprouts and microgreens. With our sprouts, you would be consuming a germinated seed. So think of it as you would be eating the whole sprout. You eat the seed, you eat the roots, the stem, and the cotyledons. So you can imagine, if there's any bacteria in the seed, you're consuming it. But furthermore, when you grow it in water and in warm temperatures, that bacteria can spread from seed to seed and from sprout to sprout, rendering it a potentially hazardous food. And sprouts are tasty, but I have to say they are less flavorful than microgreens, and their texture isn't as interesting. Now, microgreens are grown to a later maturity stage, so somewhere in the 7 to 21 day stage. And with our microgreens, you're growing them either in potting soil or you're growing on a hydroponic mat. And there's quite a bit of ventilation, which means that there's going to be less microbes, because anytime you have more ventilation, you're not going to have as much bacteria growing. And then with the microgreens, you harvest them above the soil line. So you would be consuming just the stem, the cotyledons, which would be the seed leaves, and then potentially the first true leaves. So you're not eating the seed and you're not eating the roots. So with microgreens, there's going to be a lower level of risk because you're leaving that seed behind in the potting soil or in that hydroponic mat. And then one of the positives with microgreens is that they're so delicious. They have a stronger flavor and the texture is just very interesting. So I'm a big fan. I'm really happy to have made that transition from growing sprouts to growing microgreens now. One word before we talk about how to actually grow the microgreens, I wanted to differentiate baby greens. So baby greens would be further along than the microgreens, anywhere from like 15 to 40 days old. You would have more sets of leaves on the plant. So you've all probably consumed baby lettuce or baby spinach. Microgreens would be a stage before the baby greens. With microgreens, you really don't need a lot of fancy equipment. You do need to have a container to grow them in. And I'm going to talk about 2 or 3 different options. For those of you that like to do it a little bit more officially, a little bit more commercially, I would suggest this, this setup that we have in the upper right-hand corner. Sorry. You can see that we have all these little 5 by 5 inch inserts that are inserted into this flat. And the reason this is done is so that the microgreens can be watered from the bottom. Our microgreens are delicate, and you can imagine if you're trying to water from the top, you can in fact crush some of the microgreens. So if you're interested in having a better quality of microgreen, it's nice to invest in what I like to call the pot-in-pot system, where you have little inserts, or and I'll show you another option in the next slide, but where you have the top insert that has holes in the bottom, and then you've got a tray that is waterproof. So what you do is you add the water in the bottom, and then the plants can soak up the water because these little inserts have holes on the bottom of them. Now, do you necessarily have to go the commercial route and invest in these flats and in these inserts? And the answer is no. You could certainly try growing them with what you have at home. I'm all about trying to use what you have at home. So I've tried growing them in aluminum roasting pans. I've used deli containers. I mean, there's certainly an unlimited number of containers that you could use for this purpose. But the only downside is that we wouldn't have that pot-in-pot system. But you can, in fact, successfully grow microgreens in like an aluminum roasting pan. You know, here we've got a little container. I think it held squash or maybe even baby greens at one point in time. But the one thing you really need is room for 1 inch to 1.5 inches of soil, and you're good to go. The one thing that I would insist upon is that whatever container you use needs to be clean. Here's another option for growing microgreens. You could use the 20-row seed flat, and I know Johnny's Selected Seeds is a big fan of this particular method. So you'll notice that we've got 20 different rows. So you could, maybe you could decide, okay, I'm going to plant beet microgreens in the first 3 rows. I'm going to put, kale in the next 4 rows. And then you could split it up, which is a really nice system to use. With the 20-row seed flat, once again, you do have holes on the bottom of it. So you would have to put this seed flat into a leak-proof tray, and then you would have the capacity to water from the bottom. Now, as far as growing media, you have options there too. Commercially, we're seeing a lot of producers that are using sterile hydroponic grow pads. I tried using hemp pads. There's rock wool. I think there's even coir pads that are out there. But we still see some commercial producers that are using sterile potting mix. For those of you that are growing at home, it is possible to find those hydroponic grow pads, on Amazon and on other online places. So it's possible to do that. But I would actually say that if you're new to this, start off with potting soil first. Now, don't use garden soil. Garden soil doesn't work well in containers. It can contain weed seeds and it's not sterile. Instead, start with brand new potting mix. Don't reuse the potting mix. Um, Anecdotally, we've heard that microgreens that are grown in a potting mix taste better than those that are grown hydroponically. Now, I don't have conclusive data, but we're seeing that it might taste maybe just a little bit better, be a little bit more flavorful. We're also finding that there are lower bacterial counts if you're using potting mix as opposed to a hydroponic grow pad. And what's interesting is that's because of the composition of your potting mix. A lot of our potting soils contain peat, and peat has a really low pH. So it's quite acidic, and that helps keep the microbial counts down, which is good. I would also say that a potting mix works a lot better if you're growing a crop that has smaller seeds. So if this is going to be your first time growing microgreens, start off with a potting mix. All right, so let's get to the crops that you can grow. There's so many different crops that you can grow, and oh, they're so tasty. But this first group, I'm focusing on crops with with edible leaves that should be quite familiar to you. Now, looking at these, you've probably had kale greens before. You've probably had arugula, but you can grow these same crops as a microgreen. Now, you'll see radish there. Yes, you can consume the radish microgreens. And that's one of my favorites because I like a microgreen that has a little bit of spice to it, a little zing to it. And radish definitely has that. Arugula and kale are good too. They're a little bit more pungent and a lot of nutrition there. But of all the microgreen seeds, my favorite has to be mustard. Now with mustard, you get a little bit, it's just a little bit more pungent, but I really like it, and it has a little bit of spice to it. We get into our beets and our Swiss chards. They're really good standard microgreens. Our brassicas would include our broccoli, kohlrabi, cabbage, and I guess kale also. Cress, scallions. So those are some really good ones. And then you'll also find that there are mixes. As you can find like a mild microgreen mix that will have several species like that. We're also seeing more microgreens that are derived from herbs. So we're seeing basil, parsley, cilantro, and dill as microgreen crops. And then newer ones like sorrel, anise hyssop, and lemon balm. The one thing is that I think it's a little bit more expensive to grow the herbs as microgreens than the vegetables. I've noticed there's a little bit of a price difference there. But there are just a ton of different crops that you can grow. So carrot. So imagine eating carrot microgreens or gem marigold. And I've got a photo of gem marigold there. Now you can see that's the whole plant. But when I'm talking gem marigold, I'm not talking about the French marigolds or the African marigolds. I'm talking about Tagetes tenuifolia, and that particular species has more of a dissected leaf to it, and it makes for a very nice microgreen. Then we've got nasturtium and celosia, which we think of more as an ornamental. And then amaranth. Amaranth has been very popular in Africa because it's so nutritious, but as a microgreen, it's just drop dead gorgeous. So imagine a pan of amaranth and it has these beautiful red stems and leaves. It's just a very beautiful microgreen crop to grow. That one I would grow a little bit on the drier side. You don't want to overwater when you're growing amaranth. And then the bottom three, black oil sunflower, peas, corn, and popcorn, we don't technically call those microgreens, we call those shoots. And they're some of my favorites. Absolutely enjoy eating black oil sunflower shoots, pea shoots, and corn and popcorn. I'll go into more detail on how to grow those particular crops. There are some microgreens to avoid. I would say avoid lettuce microgreens. I really tried to grow lettuce microgreens. I was very disappointed in it. And I think part of it is that the lettuce microgreens were very fragile, but they were also very bland tasting. It just didn't seem to have much flavor in comparison to the other microgreens that I was growing. So I have not grown lettuce microgreens in a very long time. Spinach is another one that is harder to grow. It's not impossible, but it's harder. And that's because when you're growing microgreens, you want all the seeds to germinate at around the same time so you can harvest the crop all at once. Spinach is a little bit harder to germinate, and that's because spinach seed in general is just a little bit more variable. It takes longer, and you're not going to necessarily have uniform germination. So spinach is a harder microgreen, and for that reason, it's on this list. And then, of course, we don't want to be consuming crops that are toxic or that may have toxic foliage. And that would include the nightshade crops. Nightshade would include our tomatoes, peppers, eggplants. So, you don't want to eat tomato microgreens because it contains toxins. I've never seen anybody eat cucurbit or bean microgreens. If you want to be on the safe side, go to a seed website and see what they sell for microgreens. The Johnny Selected Seed website is a great resource, and you'll see the microgreens that are commonly produced and are safe to eat. When you're purchasing seeds, there's some things to think about. You want to have fresh seed. You don't want seed that's 3 years old. Now, I made the mistake of trying to germinate old seed, and sure enough, you get variable seed germination. Some of the seed doesn't germinate at all. Some of it germinates right away. Others, it takes a week to actually germinate. And that's just not a good way to grow microgreens. So, start off with with fresh seed that's not older than a year. For safety's sake, make sure that the seeds are not treated with fungicide. There are certain vegetable crops like peas, corn, and spinach that are more likely to be treated with fungicide because those are seeds that are more likely to rot in the garden. So just make sure that they're not treated. And if you're concerned, you could also purchase organic pea, corn, and spinach seed. That way you know that they're not treated with fungicide. From an economy point of view, don't buy like the small seed packets that you would use to seed a row in your garden. Instead, it's a lot more economical to buy in bulk. A couple of the companies that I've ordered from included Johnny Selected Seeds and True Leaf Market. So I think those are two of the bigger producers, but there's definitely more companies that are starting to sell microgreen seeds. You're going to see that it's becoming more prevalent. And you might see a couple different classifications. You may see the true microgreens, and then you may see the shoots, such as pea shoots. Now, when it comes to planting, you would fill your container with anywhere from 1 inch to 1.5 inches of media. So I guess you could use potting soil for that. And then density is very important. You want it to be dense. So if you look at the photo in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see that you want these seeds to germinate and for them to be very thick in that pan. So I mean that you want the canopy to close. In order for that to happen, you need to have about 10 seeds per square inch is kind of the rule of thumb. And that's for the smaller seeds, for like kale, for mustard, radish. So about 10 per square inch is good. Now, you'll see that in that particular pan, I just kind of sprinkled it around, but you can do a better job of getting it distributed throughout the pan. They do sell a nice tool called a microgreen shaker, and the microgreen shaker is like a salt and and pepper shaker. It has the holes in it. However, those holes are the right size for various seeds. And using that, you can actually distribute it throughout your planting tray much more evenly than what I've got in that particular pan. When it comes to larger seeds, of course, that's going to be a little bit easier to spread around the pan, but keep in mind that you're not going to be able to get 10 pea seeds into a square inch. So you would use your judgment and plant a little less densely than that. For most of the seeds, you don't need to soak the seeds before planting. You would just distribute them over your potting mix. But there are 4 species that I think that benefit greatly from having a little bit of a water soak. That would include our pea shoots, popcorn or corn shoots, sunflower, and buckwheat. You'll notice that for the peas, you would soak for about 12 to 24 hours. And during that time, I would say like every 8 hours or so, or every 8 to 12 hours, you would just rinse it and refill again, but do that for a maximum of 24 hours. And you can do that at room temperature. Same for the, for the buckwheat, you would soak that for 2 days. With respect to the popcorn, the corn, and the sunflower, you would soak anywhere from 12 to 24 hours, but you would do this at a cooler temperature. So you could actually refrigerate your container that is holding the seed. But by soaking them, it's imbibing the water, and with respect to those 4 crops, they will germinate faster and more efficiently. For the other crops, don't soak them, particularly basil. Don't soak them. Basil has a coating on it. Once it gets wet, it turns into a sticky mess. So that's one you would never soak. All right, so you've distributed your seeds over the potting soil. The next step is you want to ensure good seed to soil contact. And what I normally do is I just lightly pat the seed into the potting soil. Now you don't want to compress the potting soil, but I mean, just make sure that there's a little bit of contact there. And then the next part may surprise you. I don't cover the seed with potting soil. I just leave it on the surface of the potting soil. I water them using a spray bottle. And then we cover the container or the flat. There are different covers we can use. If you're using a flat, you can certainly use that germination dome that you see at the bottom. If you're using a non-standard container, you could use plastic wrap. We've got other individuals that use a wet paper towel to do it. The important thing is until the seeds germinate, they do need to be experiencing a higher humidity. Once the majority of seeds have germinated, then you need to remove the dome and remove the plastic and then just grow them in the open air. We want to make sure that they're getting some ventilation. For watering, I would check them twice daily because they do dry out quite quickly since there's not a whole lot of potting soil there. I mostly use a spray bottle. If I'm growing like in an aluminum roasting pan, if I'm growing in that pot and pot system, then I do like to water from the bottom. And once again, I would reiterate that's the best technique because you're not putting water on the plants. The plants are kind of fragile and they could lodge. So if you have the option to have a pot and pot system and water from the bottom, you'll have the best quality. However, it's still possible to successfully grow microgreens using a spray bottle if that's what you have at home. So you can certainly experiment with different methods. Um, one good thing is that fertilizer is not necessary for the shorter microgreens. The microgreens that are only going to take, 1 to 2 weeks, they do have enough energy stored up in their seeds so that they're able to grow quite successfully for a couple of weeks. If you're growing larger microgreens such as peas, then I might encourage you to use just a very weak fertilizer. But for the most part, fertilizer is not going to be necessary for the vast majority of microgreens. With your growing conditions, you don't necessarily need special equipment. You can grow microgreens in a windowsill. I've been known to grow microgreens on the floor in front of patio windows to make sure that they get some light. If you have vertical shelving, you could certainly install some grow lights and grow them that way, like you see in that photo there. They're being grown with fluorescent lights, but I know a lot of our master gardeners and others might be purchasing LED lights. So either system works there. As far as temperatures, I would grow them somewhere between 65 and 75. If it comes to our brassicas, like our broccoli and cabbage, I would grow closer to the 65 range than the 75 range. These are quick crops. Now, sunflower only takes like 7 to 14 days. And then on the right, I've got blanched corn or popcorn. And that takes, I'd say it takes closer to 7 than 10 days with respect to corn and popcorn. You'll notice that the corn on the right is yellow. And that's because we treat corn a little bit differently. We don't want the corn to green up. So I blanch that crop. And what I mean by blanching is that I grow it in a dark closet so it doesn't get any light. And with our corn, we don't want them to turn green because it'll get a little bit more woody and it's just not going to have the same flavor and texture. So of all the crops, corn or popcorn would be the one that you would grow in the closet and you don't need any lights. And the other thing is that, well, we'll talk about harvesting in another slide. All right, timing for the rest of our microgreens, usually somewhere in the 10 to 18 day range for like kale, mustard, radish, cress, and peas. So really quick. So I think a lot of you can imagine, starting crops and having something to consume in like 2 weeks. I mean, that's fabulous. Just absolutely fabulous at this time of year when we're kind of snowbound and when we want some nice fresh produce. There are some crops that are slower to grow, and that would include Swiss chard and beet. And we know they're a little bit slower to grow because that's how they are in the garden. Carrots, definitely a little bit slower. And then some of our herbs, cilantro, parsley, and basil. And then, of course, celery and red amaranth take a little bit more time. All right, so how do we harvest this? Oh, my daughter would kill me. This is a picture of her when she was 10, and we were just starting our adventures with growing pea shoots and such. And she's 16 now and a very beautiful young woman now. But harvesting is the most time-consuming part of the entire process. And you would harvest when the microgreens are somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 3 inches tall. You kind of get a sense for it, after you've grown a couple of times. But most of the microgreens, you can harvest them after, after they've shot up and produced cotyledons, or even you can wait for that first true set of leaves. You'll get a sense as to when to harvest because you could certainly taste them. Our pea shoots, you would let them get taller. You can let them get, 3 to 6 inches tall and harvest. With respect to the vast majority of our microgreens, you will only get one harvest. And that's because the plant will exhaust the resources that were in the original seed. So you would not get a second wave of growth after you harvest. There are two exceptions that I know of, both wheatgrass and pea shoots. You might be able to get a second harvest from them, and it helps if you do fertilize those two. With respect to harvesting, as I mentioned, this is the most time-consuming part because most people do this with scissors. So what you end up doing is you clip the microgreens right above the soil line, and you leave the seed and you leave the roots in the potting soil. So this is just time consuming because you can do just a small group at a time, and you need to be gentle so that in fact you're not damaging the microgreens. Now, our commercial producers do have some interesting methods that speed up the process. Our commercial producers, a lot of them are using those hydroponic grow mats. So you can imagine that the individual plants are sticking to the hydroponic grow pads because the root system is embedded in it. That means you can actually pick up the entire hydroponic pad, hold it vertically, and then take an electric knife and just slice off the microgreens. So that works really nice and slick. Another method that I've heard from farmers market producers is that they will grow they will grow the microgreens in a smaller pot, like that 5 by 5 inch insert, or they'll grow it in a 4 by 4 inch pot. And what they'll do is they'll squeeze that together, and then they'll bring a large pair of scissors and make one cut, and they're able to cut off everything in that one pot. So hopefully you're able to visualize that. So, sorry, I've got a little tickle in my throat. No, popcorn. I promised you more information on popcorn. And I absolutely love growing this because the flavor is absolutely astounding. It's like eating fresh corn on the cob. But it's a unique crop because you'll notice that it's got these little needle-like shoots. And what you want to do is you grow it in the closet, and then when you're ready to harvest, you bring it out and you clip these little needles. But you want to do so before the leaves unroll. So you'll see that there are those little yellow leaves coming out of that white little tube there. Those are the leaves. You want to harvest it before they unroll. If the popcorn leaves unroll, it'll be at a maturity stage where it's going to be a little woodier. It's not going to be as flavorful. So it's better to harvest young when it comes to corn and popcorn. But that's a fun one to grow. It's one you should try with your kids and your grandkids because they will be shocked by how sweet and flavorful these little popcorn shoots or corn shoots are. Here's our sunflower seeds. You can see that with our sunflowers, it's good to harvest them at the cotyledon stage. And with the cotyledon stage, that would be when you have that first set of leaves. Those are the seed leaves. If you look at the right-hand photo, that's the middle photo, you can see the cotyledons are fully expanded. You could certainly harvest at that stage. In the second, or I should say in the third sunflower shoot, you'll notice that there's another set of leaves growing. That would be the true leaves that are starting to grow. You want to harvest before those true leaves get too big because the shoots would get a little woodier and also not be as palatable. So you can certainly harvest at the cotyledon stage or at the stage when the first true leaves are not too large. Now, once you've gone through the trouble of harvesting, I would say eat them as fast as you can. They don't store very well because they're very fragile and the harvesting process may have injured them. So eat them as fast as you can. They can be refrigerated for about 3 to 5 days. Before you consume them, make sure that you rinse them. Now, most people eat them raw. I mentioned using them as vegetable confetti, so you can use it as an edible garnish. So you'll notice that in lots of restaurants. I actually like to eat like a big pile of microgreens with a little bit of salad dressing on them. I'll take different microgreens and add them to a lettuce salad to make it more interesting. You can top a sandwich with it. Add it to the top of soup before you serve it. Or maybe when you're making pizza, you can add microgreens after you take that pizza out of the oven. So fun ways to eat them. Here I've got some pea shoots, and I like to eat them very simply. I just put a little bit of ranch dressing on them, but they're like a taste of spring because you really do get that pea flavor from those pea shoots. So they're just fun to grow and eat. So I have a few recipes here. I'm going to give my PDF to Alicia after we're done here, but I'll go a little bit slower with the recipes. Some of you may want to take photos using your phone, but we've got this recipe that calls for taking a mild microgreen mix. Now, they're all different mixes of microgreens that you can grow. So you can take that, add in some grated carrots, and then dice up some avocados and tomatoes, making sure that you dice them kind of small. Toss that with a little bit of Italian vinaigrette and add some sunflower seeds. I had a chef tell me about how fabulous basil microgreens are. And one of the things that this chef liked to do is he liked to pair the basil microgreens with strawberries. And then he would use a very top quality balsamic vinegar and honey. And that flavor combination is supposed to be absolutely fantastic. Um, Now, other ideas, you can put microgreens on your taco. I like to use arugula microgreens and put them on my roast beef sandwich with a little bit of Dijon mustard. Here's another recipe that's meant to be, very similar to caprese salad, where you've got tomatoes and fresh mozzarella. Now, this one starts off with that mild microgreen blend. You slice in and cut, or I would say you kind of shred the basil. So the basil is kind of is very, very narrow. And then, dice some tomatoes, put in some fresh mozzarella, and then drizzle that with olive oil, balsamic vinegar, and sea salt. Doesn't that sound fabulous? And here's one that calls for making a lime dressing. This is for those of you that like a citrus type dressing, one that's a little bit more tart. So that starts off with some lime juice, adding in some mustard, salt, and olive oil, and salt and pepper to taste. Let's talk a little bit about nutrition here and taste. Now, radish, mustard, and kale would be those that are on the spicy side of the spectrum. Our brassicas like broccoli, kohlrabi, well, I guess kale would be included in that too. Cabbage would be more pungent, maybe a little bit more bitter. I know that a lot of individuals don't like vegetables because they taste a little bit bitter, but I would say it's worth trying to develop a taste for that, because if you're tasting a little hint of bitterness, there's a lot of antioxidants and good nutrients and vitamins that are in there. So it's worth developing a little bit of tolerance for bitterness. So I mentioned pea shoots taste like peas. So there's just a wide range of flavors out there. So try different crops. If you don't like one crop, try another one. Now we're starting to understand more about the nutrition of microgreens. We had a USDA study from 2012 that showed that microgreens in general have 5 times the level of vitamins and antioxidants of a mature plant. So, that's fabulous. And for those of you that are less likely to eat a pile of vegetables, maybe you would eat a smaller mound of microgreens. And if you knew that you were getting more nutrients in your microgreens, you might be more willing to try them. All right. Now here's a study showing, different vitamins that have been found. Now this study was quite limited. It didn't trial, the wide breadth of microgreens that are now available. But you can see that red cabbage, amaranth, and radish had significant amounts of vitamin C. If you're looking for vitamin A to enhance your eye health, look to red sorrel, cilantro, and red cabbage. Vitamin K, which I think is related to blood clotting and is an important vitamin. You could consume amaranth, red sorrel, and green basil. Vitamin E is found in radish. I never thought of radish as being a source of a lot of vitamins, but when it comes to the microgreens, radish seems to do quite well, as does some of the herbs like cilantro. The one exception to this would be those blanched popcorn shoots that I showed you earlier. Now, the crops that are not exposed to light are less likely to develop significant levels of vitamins and antioxidants. So unfortunately, the blanched corn, while it tastes good, is not going to be a huge supplier of vitamins. Growing microgreens is great for exercising with children. So the one thing that we know is that this is great so that kids can start plants from seed and they can see the plant mature in a couple weeks. So having a quick turnaround time means that it's very easy to in fact complete a project, and you really don't need a lot of materials. Anytime we work with children, whether it's in the garden or doing these types of exercises, we are encouraging them to eat healthy, and we know that children like to eat what they have planted. Furthermore, kids are more likely to consume microgreens because they can be consumed raw. We know that kids like raw things, like think carrot sticks, but try and sell them on the microgreens. But a fantastic, chance to get your children to eat a little bit more nutritiously, and tell them they don't have to eat a ton in order to get a lot of vitamins, because remember, those microgreens are just loaded with a ton of nutrients. All right. Now, as we conclude here, I want to talk and conclude with ways to reduce your food safety risk. Now, we know microgreens are much, much safer than our alfalfa sprouts because we're not consuming the seeds in the root system. But there's some additional things we can do to reduce food safety risk. We can buy seeds from a reputable source. We could use new potting soil. We make sure that our containers are clean, and we make sure that we're not growing our microgreens too wet because we don't want mold to start growing on the potting soil. When it comes to harvesting, we would sterilize our scissors, and then we would store our microgreens in the refrigerator if we don't eat them right away, and then we would make sure to rinse before we eat. So microgreens, you're going to see a lot more of those in the coming years. And, science is trying to make sure that they're filling in the gaps in our knowledge. So they're looking at ways to actually better sterilize the seeds. They're going to be looking at what are the nutritional benefits of other types of microgreen crops. They'll also be searching for new crops that can be grown as microgreens, new species, and maybe some wild species or wild relatives of known vegetables. They're going to be looking at how they can boost the nutritional aspects of microgreens by manipulating the light quality. So think of those LED lights, are there certain wavelengths that are essential to increase the antioxidant level? And then finally, you're going to be seeing more local production with our microgreens having a limited shelf life. It makes sense that we would be growing them and buying them from local producers.